If you ask me, studio apartment life is pure bliss. This studio apartment is what gave me the chance to start it all over again during the toughest season of my life, which, made me feel at my lowest ever. And this for me was a space where I could have the freedom to heal and, to be whoever I wanted to be and feel whatever and whenever I wanted to feel. For a while, I'm not exaggerating when I say this, but for a while, this studio apartment and my cat waiting for me in this studio apartment by the door every day were one of the few certainties that I had in life for that time. Sure, studio apartment life is not meant for everyone, and let's not sugarcoat it. It's not always nice and pretty, but still, I choose it a million times over and over again. Also, I have been living in this very studio for more than 2 years, and this is not my first small apartment or studio apartment living experience, so I kind of consider myself an expert on the topic. So in today's video, we're going to tackle the good, the bad, and the ugly of studio apartment living. Well, first things first, we're gonna start with the good vibes. And whenever I think of the good things about living in a studio apartment, the first thing that, of course, pops into my mind is the cozy factor, because let's face it, that is unbeatable. There is nothing like a studio apartment, in my opinion, that has the power to make you feel like you are in your own private nest. So in a small space, but still comfy, that makes you feel comfy and safe. And if I think of the cozy factor, the first thing that I can think of is me in my studio. So sitting on the bed or laying on the bed or on the couch, my cat sleeping next to me, fairy lights on, a few candles maybe, and I'm all curled up with a book or with something to watch on Netflix, and that is awesome. Obviously, living in a studio apartment is cheaper than other living arrangements, both for rent and utilities. And also, this is kind of like the perfect solution, in my opinion, for all of those like me who are not willing or no longer willing, because I did it in the past and I'm just kind of over it, to share the space with roommates, because that can be challenging. It's not always that easy. So studio apartments are a perfect way to maintain your privacy and independence without having to share the space with somebody, but still at reasonable costs, because there is less living surface to pay for, and usually utilities for smaller apartments tend to be much cheaper. Studio apartments are easier and faster to clean and to keep clean. What else do you need? Living in a studio apartment forces you to keep things simple and to be mindful about your belongings. When you live in such a small space, there literally is no space for the unnecessary. So this means that you kind of have to keep things simple, to be mindful about the things that you want to bring into your own space, and to regularly reevaluate things to make sure that, again, there is nothing unnecessary around you. I partly mentioned this already, but living in a studio apartment means to have complete freedom to be, feel, live whatever you want to, do things however and whenever you want to do them. You can be the king, queen, or in between of your own space, and nobody is going to argue that. You don't have to ask permission to anybody, and you don't have to justify yourself to anybody. For example, you want to dance in your underwear in the middle of the room for an hour? That's great, you can do it. I do it too. It's freeing, it's fun. Nobody's there to judge you, and you can burn a few calories in between. So this is what I mean. You can literally decide to do and manage the space in which way you prefer, and nobody is there to judge you or to ask you to do otherwise. It is, in some cases, easier to furnish because you don't need a lot of big bulky furniture to make the space feel complete and homey. You only need the few core furniture pieces, and then the rest is played by the core and details. So that's how you make a studio apartment homey. You don't have to spend a lot of money on furnishing and decor, and you can still make a pretty beautiful living space without having a lot of big bulky furniture and to, to spend a lot of money for it. Moving on to the bad sides of studio apartment living, because as much as I love it, there are a few things that might be difficult or challenging at times. And of course, the first thing that I can think of is the limited or sometimes very limited storage space. Storage, it can be a problem. Despite how mindful you are about your belongings, sometimes there is just difficulties in managing how you can store things in your own studio apartment, because again, the space is not infinite in here, and this makes you or forces you to, play Tetris all the time. And yeah, despite your creative efforts or, creative attempts to, store things in different ways or creatively, that might not always get the job done. Because again, the space is so limited in here, if one thing is messy, untidy, disorganized, dusty and dirty, then everything else looks like that. Luckily, the space is much easier and faster to clean than other living arrangements or bigger homes and apartments, but still, that can be something frustrating at times, because if one thing looks untidy or disorganized, then the rest of the space is more likely to look like that. Again, this is something space related. It's difficult to have guests coming over or to entertain people in a way that makes them feel comfortable, because you don't have a lot of space for a lot of people. So you kind of like have to keep that in mind, that you cannot always invite a lot of people over because there's not going to be a lot of space for them. I live by myself, so I can speak only in terms of what I think it might be. But if you decide to co-live in a studio apartment, so to share the space with someone, well, things are going to get, in my opinion, very crowded and very messy a lot. So that is something that you want to keep in mind, because again, the space is small, so you want to be extremely mindful about that. You are not going to be able to have your own private corners. On the other side of the spectrum, if you live in your own studio apartment like me, well, congratulations, this space is yours. This might not be relatable for everyone watching, but I love living in my studio apartment. It is absolutely fantastic for me, and I love it 99.5% of the times. That 0.5% of the times is when the difficulties of studio apartment living tend to show, and one of these might exactly be related to sharing the space with someone. Things can, if you live here for a while by yourself, things can get a little too little and lonely sometimes. You kind of miss, or I kind of miss, at least I speak for myself, kind of miss having like a little bit of more room to breathe and be and exist. And sometimes I do miss the daily routine of sharing the space with someone. But luckily, at least in my case, I think the positive side is that's still much more than the negative side, so that kind of balance things out. Yes, it is true that you don't need a lot of big bulky furniture pieces to furnish and style a studio apartment. True, but it might require you a lot of time, patience, and effort to find the things that are just going to fit perfectly in the space, because the space is so limited. You can't just walk into any store or thrift store, find something that you like, and that is magically going to fit. You have to be very specific and very, very sure about the measurements, because not everything is going to fit in here. So this might take more time and more research than for people who live in a normal apartment that have more space available to play with when it comes to furnishing and decor. I don't consider this necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that you want to keep into consideration, or I want to keep into consideration when it comes to the bad sides of studio apartment living. When you cook something, the entire place is gonna smell of the food that you just cooked. Now, depending on what you cook, that can be, a little more challenging But the thing is that usually studio apartments don't really have, mine doesn't have it, and I rarely seen studio apartments that have separation between the kitchen and the main living area. So when you cook something, then the entire place is gonna smell of the food that you just cooked. So yeah. Also, something that just kind of like hits me really hard is one of the biggest things that I kind of like miss of regular apartments is the lack of windows and the lack of natural light. Usually studio apartments don't have a lot of windows. They tend to have one big window in the main living area. If you're lucky, you have two, usually maybe like a smaller one in the kitchen or so, but then the rest of the space sits in the dark without having the possibility to have, you know, like fresh air coming in and out of the window and natural light. And finally, the two things that I consider to be, you know, kind of like the bad of the baddest, so the ugly of studio apartment living. I mentioned already that if one thing looks messy, untidy, dusty, then the rest of the space is much more likely to look like that compared to regular sized apartments. But if you do share the space, your studio apartment, with an animal, so let's say a small dog or a cat like I do, then hair is gonna show a lot quicker. So everything is just going to be much more noticeable, much faster. So this is going to require you a lot of patience and effort to keep things clean, to make sure that there are no crazy amount of hair, you know, gathering around on your furniture, sofa, blankets, and whatever. And how can I not talk about the big, bulky, and not so nice looking elephant in the room, the clothes drying rack. I don't know about you, maybe if you live in a studio, you're lucky enough to have a balcony of some sort. I don't, and so whenever I do laundry, which is twice a week, then the big, bulky, not so particularly nice looking drying rack is going to sit in the middle of my main living area in my studio, and that is going to be in the way. And when you have clothes to dry, then they literally sit in the middle of your room because you don't really have another place to put them to dry unless you have a dryer. I do not have space for a dryer. Even if I would have space for a dryer, I wouldn't purchase that because that thing sucks so much electricity and energy like nothing else in this world, and it's not particularly environmentally friendly, so you do you. But yeah, that drying rack is constantly in the way, and sometimes, you know, it's just really frustrating. There you have it, people. The good, the bad, and the ugly of studio apartment living. I am really curious to know if there's anything that you know, have experienced of the things that I mentioned in your personal studio apartment living experience. So just make sure to leave a comment below. If you have enjoyed this video, I hope you did. Just please like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel if you still haven't. Thank you all so much for watching. I will see you in my next one.